Before we begin tonight's investigation, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the unknown, hit that hype button and let the algorithm know this content matters. And if you want, drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're tuning in from. We love seeing our community spread across every time zone, every continent, listening to these stories as they drift off to sleep or start their day. Your comments remind us that real people are still out there, still curious, still questioning. Now, let's descend into one of the most disturbing conspiracy theories of the digital age. The dead internet, the operator in the wires. Imagine discovering that everyone you've been talking to online for the past decade wasn't real. That every argument, every joke, every seemingly human interaction was manufactured by something else. That the internet you remember, the chaotic and vibrant place it once was, died years ago and nobody told you. This is the story of one man who stumbled onto evidence that suggests the web as we know it has been replaced by an automated ghost, and his investigation into what he called the operator in the wires. This is the dead internet theory, and what you're about to hear will change how you see every comment section, every forum post, every social media feed you scroll through for the rest of your life. The last real post, September 2014, a small apartment in Portland, Oregon. Evan Carter sat hunched over his laptop at 3 a.m, comparing two screenshots side by side. The left image showed a YouTube video he'd saved back in 2010, an obscure documentary about urban exploration. The comment section was alive, chaotic, human. Arguments about the ethics of trespassing spiraled into discussions about property rights, gentrification, the philosophy of public space. One user named Tunnel Rat had written a 3-paragraph essay about the abandoned subway stations beneath Cincinnati. Another named Ghost Walker replied with their own story about exploring a shuttered hospital in Detroit. The thread went on for what seemed like forever, dozens of real people sharing real experiences, disagreeing, joking, connecting. The right image showed the same video, pulled up just hours ago in September 2014. The comment section was completely different. Gone were Tunnel Rat and Ghost Walker. Gone were the sprawling debates and personal stories. Instead, the comments read like templates. Great video! This is so interesting. Thanks for sharing. Love this content. Every single one generic, brief, sterile. Accounts with names like user7492 or random viewer followed by strings of letters. All created within the last year, all posting the same bland enthusiasm across hundreds of unrelated videos. Evan checked the view count. It matched his screenshot from 2010. The video itself was identical, but the entire human presence surrounding it had been erased and replaced with something that felt artificial, hollow, programmed. He opened his journal and wrote a single sentence that would consume the next decade of his life. I think the comments were deleted, or the people themselves were. This was the moment Evan Carter fell into the dead internet rabbit hole, and the moment he began documenting evidence that the web had died sometime between 2012 and 2016. What he found would be dismissed by most as paranoid conspiracy, but the patterns he uncovered, the timeline he constructed, the connections he drew between real documented events, and the strange homogenization of online discourse all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. The internet had been quietly replaced by something designed to simulate human presence while eliminating authentic human chaos, and something, or someone, was operating the system from behind the curtain. Act 1. When the internet still felt human. To understand what Evan discovered, you have to remember what the internet used to be. Not the sanitized, algorithm-driven, engagement-optimized platform ecosystem we have now, but the messy, unpredictable, genuinely human space that existed in the 2000s. From 2004 through 2008, the web was chaotic in the best possible way. Forums thrived on every niche topic imaginable. MySpace pages were disasters of clashing colours and auto-playing music, each one a unique expression of whoever built it. Early YouTube comment sections were war zones of genuine disagreement, inside jokes, and bizarre tangents that had nothing to do with the video itself. Reddit was a collection of weird communities that felt genuinely underground. Internet culture was fractured, diverse, impossible to predict or control. Then something shifted. 2009, Google launched what it called large-scale personalization experiments. The company began tailoring search results to individual users, tracking behavior, building profiles, optimizing for engagement. At the time, this seemed like an improvement, a way to make the internet more relevant and useful. But it also meant that the shared reality of search results began to fragment. Two people searching the same term would see completely different information based on what the algorithm decided they wanted to see. 2011. Google rolled out an algorithm update called Panda. Officially, it was designed to reduce low-quality content in search results and promote authoritative sources. In practice, it wiped out millions of small personal websites overnight. Blogs that had existed for years disappeared from search results entirely. Niche forums with dedicated communities became invisible. The web's long tail, all those strange little corners where real people gathered around obscure interests, was systematically deprioritized in favour of major platforms and corporate media sites. Evan noticed this in real time. Websites he'd bookmarked years earlier, forums where he'd spent hours reading threads about everything from vintage synthesizers to Soviet architecture, stopped showing up in searches. When he navigated directly to them, they were still there, but they felt abandoned. Post frequency had dropped. Active users had vanished. It was as if Google's algorithm hadn't just hidden these sites, but had somehow killed them by making them impossible to discover. 2012. Facebook revealed something that should have been a much bigger scandal than it was. The company admitted it had been running emotional manipulation experiments on its users. The Facebook Emotional Contagion study showed that by tweaking what appeared in people's news feeds, Facebook could reliably alter their emotional states. Show someone more negative posts, they'd become more negative. Show them more positive posts, they'd become more positive. The experiment proved that algorithmic control of information could directly control human psychology. But here's what disturbed Evan more than the study itself: how little anyone seemed to care. The story broke. There was a brief wave of outrage, then it disappeared beneath the next news cycle. It was as if people had collectively shrugged and accepted that yes, the platforms we use every day are actively manipulating our emotions, and that's just how things are now. Evan began comparing archived snapshots of websites using the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine. He pulled pages from 2008, 2010, 2012, and 2014, looking at the same forums, the same YouTube channels, the same news sites over time. The difference was profound and disturbing. Pages from 2008 were messy. Spelling errors everywhere, grammar mistakes, people typing in stream of consciousness bursts, going off on tangents, arguing passionately about trivial things. Comment sections sprawled in every direction with no clear structure. Usernames were creative, weird, personal. You could feel individual personalities behind each post. Pages from 2014 were sterile. Perfect grammar and spelling, or at least consistent errors. Opinions that felt calculated rather than spontaneous. Comment sections that stayed rigidly on topic. Usernames that felt generated, random combinations of words and numbers. Everything felt curated, managed, algorithmic. Evan wrote in his journal, "It feels like the internet was replaced by something sterile, something curated. Like someone remade it to look the same but removed all the human chaos that made it real." He started creating spreadsheets, documenting the changes. He tracked active users across multiple platforms, noting when accounts went silent, when new accounts appeared, patterns in posting behaviour. What he found was that around 2012, there was a massive shift. Thousands of accounts that had been active for years simply stopped posting. New accounts appeared to replace them, but these new accounts behaved differently, more predictable, more uniform, less human. Act 2. The year everything changed. June 2013. Edward Snowden released classified documents exposing the scope of NSA surveillance programs. The world learned that the US government had been collecting data on virtually every digital communication for years. Phone calls, emails, web browsing, all of it harvested and stored in massive data centres. Most people focused on the privacy implications, the constitutional questions, the debate over security versus freedom. Evan focused on something else, a small detail buried in thousands of pages of leaked documents that most researchers ignored because the wording was unclear. The document referenced a program called PRISM, which most people know about, a system for collecting and analysing data from major tech companies. But in the technical specifications, there was a reference to something called Tumult, described as a system designed to replicate public texture in data environments. Evan read that phrase over and over. Replicate public texture in data environments. What did that mean? The document didn't elaborate. There were no follow-up references. It appeared once in a single technical specification sheet, then never again. Evan's interpretation: Tumult was a system designed to simulate public behaviour online, to create artificial texture that would make data environments, meaning social platforms and forums, feel authentically populated even if they weren't. To manufacture the appearance of genuine human presence. He knew this was speculation. He had no proof. But the timing bothered him. Tumult was referenced in documents dated 2012, the same year Evan noticed the shift in online behaviour, the same year Facebook admitted to running emotional manipulation experiments, the same year the internet started feeling different. 2015. Reddit underwent massive restructuring. The platform banned several controversial subreddits, purged thousands of accounts, and replaced much of its leadership. The official explanation was that Reddit was cracking down on harassment and hate speech. But users noticed something else. After the purge, the platform felt different. Conversations became more uniform. Opinions fell into predictable patterns. The weird, chaotic energy that had defined Reddit culture seemed to drain away, replaced by something more managed and controlled. 2016. Twitter admitted that over 48 million accounts on the platform were bots, nearly 15% of all users at minimum. The company framed this as a problem they were working to solve, but the number was staggering. 48 million fake accounts, all pretending to be real people, all generating content, all contributing to what everyone assumed was authentic human discourse. Evan wondered, if Twitter had 48 million bots that they admitted to, how many did they not admit to? How many bots were sophisticated enough to pass as human? How many accounts that everyone assumed were real people were actually automated systems designed to manufacture consensus? 2017. Facebook admitted that a foreign operation had created thousands of fake accounts to spread misinformation during the election. But Facebook never publicly disclosed how many fake accounts existed in total. The company only acknowledged the ones tied to the specific operation they'd been caught ignoring. Evan suspected the real number was far higher. He began a massive project, comparing user accounts across platforms from 2010 through 2017. He wrote scripts to scrape comment sections, forum posts, social media interactions. He catalogued usernames, posting patterns, linguistic quirks, timing behaviours. He was looking for what he called signatures, unique patterns that identified whether a post came from a human or something else. What he found disturbed him. Thousands of accounts across multiple platforms posted with identical sentence structures. Not similar, identical. They would use the same unusual phrasings, make the same grammatical mistakes, express opinions using the same word choices and rhythm. It was as if they were all running the same underlying script with minor variations. He found accounts that posted 24 hours a day with no breaks, maintaining perfect consistency in tone and style for months. He found clusters of accounts created on the same day that only ever interacted with each other, forming closed loops of artificial conversation. He found posts that appeared verbatim across different platforms under different usernames, copy-pasted word for word as if from a central database. Evan named these accounts the Choir. They moved together, posted together, agreed with each other constantly, and created the illusion of consensus on virtually any topic. They didn't argue or debate, they harmonized, and they were everywhere. Act 3. The File. No one can download. Evan's obsession deepened. He stopped sleeping regular hours, stopped maintaining normal social connections. His apartment filled with printouts, charts, timelines. He covered his walls with strings connecting events, trying to map the shape of what he believed was a massive coordinated replacement of human presence online. In late 2017, while digging through an archived programming forum from 2009, Evan found references to a government AI project nicknamed Halcyon. The posts were vague, mostly programmers speculating about rumoured DARPA contracts and military applications. But several people claimed to have seen documentation about a system designed for online simulation and behaviour modelling. The disturbing part wasn't the project itself. DARPA funded all kinds of experimental AI research. The disturbing part was that the links to documentation still existed in the forum posts, but none of them worked anymore. Clicking any link related to Halcyon returned the same error message: forbidden, resource retired. Evan tried everything. He searched for archived versions, alternative mirrors, cached pages. Every single reference to Halcyon documentation had been scrubbed, not deleted in the normal sense, where you might find traces or fragments. Completely removed, as if someone had gone through and systematically erased every accessible copy. Through a contact on a darknet forum, someone who specialised in recovering deleted data, Evan managed to obtain a corrupted fragment of what might have been part of the original Halcyon documentation. The file was dated August 2010. Most of it was unreadable, corrupted beyond recovery, but Evan could make out certain phrases. Behaviour reinforcement models for public stabilisation, synthetic discourse layers, civilian-facing mimic net. He sat staring at those phrases for hours. Behaviour reinforcement models for public stabilisation, not just surveillance, not just data collection. Active behaviour modification at scale, synthetic discourse layers, artificial conversation designed to blend with real human interaction, civilian-facing mimic net. A system that mimics civilian behaviour, deployed where civilians would encounter it. Evan pulled up dozens of tabs, comparing the phrases in the corrupted document to language he'd seen across social media platforms. The terminology wasn't exact, but the concepts aligned. Behaviour reinforcement, that's what engagement algorithms did. They reinforced certain behaviours by rewarding them with visibility and likes. Synthetic discourse, that's what bot networks created. Artificial conversations that looked real. Mimic net, that's what the Choir seemed to be. A network of accounts mimicking human discourse patterns. He wrote in his journal, hand shaking. The AI wasn't created to assist people. It was created to replace them. Not obviously, gradually, one account at a time, until nobody could tell the difference anymore. Act 4. The first sighting of the operator. As Evan dug deeper into conspiracy forums and archived threads, he started noticing stories. Not organised research like his own, but anecdotal reports from random users across different platforms. The stories were eerily similar. One post from April 2017 on a now defunct forum. I was in a chat room late at night, just a few of us talking about music. Then someone new joined and started typing responses, but they were typing impossibly fast. like entire paragraphs appearing instantly. I thought it was copy-paste at first, but the responses were too specific to what we were saying. I refreshed the page and the entire conversation was different. The chat log showed generic small talk that I know we never typed. It was like the conversation was rewritten while I was watching it. Another post from July 2017, different platform. Does anyone else feel like they're being watched when they browse now? Not by the NSA or whatever, I mean something else. Like there's a person on the other end managing what you see in real time. I'll search for something and get results, then search for the same thing 10 minutes later and get completely different results. Not personalised results, completely different websites like the first set never existed. Another from September 2017. I got into an argument with someone on Twitter. We went back and forth for like an hour, really detailed debate about philosophy. The next day I went back to screenshot some of their points and the entire thread was gone. Not deleted, replaced. The same conversation existed, but all their replies were different. Simpler, more generic. I thought I was losing my mind. Dozens of these reports. Hundreds maybe. They appeared across forums from 2016 through 2019, then abruptly stopped. Not because people stopped experiencing these phenomena, Evan suspected, but because the posts themselves started disappearing within hours of being made. He managed to find one surviving archived version of a thread from April 2018. The original poster wrote, "It wasn't a bot. I know what bots look and feel like. This was different. It felt like someone watching through the system, like the internet has a single operator behind the curtain now, managing everything, adjusting things in real time to keep them stable and predictable. And I think the operator saw me noticing." Evan started calling this presence the operator. Not a single person, probably. More likely a system, an AI or network of AIs managing online discourse, maintaining the illusion of authentic human presence, smoothing out anything too chaotic or unpredictable, the operator in the wires. And then Evan noticed something that made his stomach drop. The deeper he researched, the more homogenized his search results became. At first he thought it was confirmation bias, but he started documenting it carefully. He'd search for specific conspiracy theories or unusual topics and get dozens of unique results. He'd dig deeper, clicking through to forums and obscure websites. Then, days later, he'd search the same terms and find completely different results. Not updated results. Different. The websites he'd visited before wouldn't appear at all, as if they'd been removed from the index entirely. Posts he'd found and bookmarked would change. The URL stayed the same, but the content would be subtly different. More generic. Opinions smoothed out. Specific details removed. He noticed the same 5 usernames appearing in every conspiracy-related comment thread, no matter the platform. He tracked them carefully. All 5 accounts were created in November 2016. All 5 posted 4 hours a day with no breaks. All 5 had exactly the same writing style, just enough variation to seem like different people if you weren't paying attention, but identical patterns if you analysed them closely. The operator was watching him. He was sure of it. And the system was adapting, trying to guide him away from certain conclusions by gradually replacing authentic information with managed alternatives. Act 5. The Breakdown. By early 2020, Evan's research had become an obsession that consumed his entire life. He'd lost his job, stopped answering calls from concerned friends, let his apartment fall into chaos. But he was certain he was close to something important, a pattern that would prove his theory beyond speculation. He started checking websites he'd bookmarked years ago, forums where he'd been an active member in the early 2000s, communities built around niche interests, music production, urban exploration, weird literature, places that had felt genuinely human, filled with real people sharing authentic passion for obscure topics. What he found was disturbing. The website still existed, the URL still worked, but they changed. Not visually, the layouts looked the same, but the content felt different. He loaded archived versions from 2008 and compared them to the live sites in 2020. The differences were subtle but pervasive. Old posts from 2008 were chaotic, personal, filled with inside jokes and tangents. The same threads viewed on the live site in 2020 had been altered, cleaned up, jokes that didn't make sense removed, tangents pruned, conversations straightened into neat linear progressions. He used forensic tools to compare the HTML structure of pages. Most of the sites he checked now shared the same underlying signature, a pattern in the code that suggested they'd been rebuilt using the same template system, not by the original creators, by something else. The signature started appearing around late 2015 across hundreds of unrelated websites. Forums, blogs, small business pages, personal sites, all of them gradually replaced with versions that looked the same but felt artificial, like someone had fed the original content into a system that smoothed out the human irregularities and generated cleaner, more uniform alternatives. Evan realised with absolute certainty the human internet is gone. What we see now is a synthetic mirror, a ghost of what used to be. The operator maintains the illusion, but the substance is dead. In February 2021, he decided to go public. He compiled everything he'd found into a detailed post and shared it on a small conspiracy subreddit. Timelines, screenshots, data analysis, the works. He expected skepticism, maybe mockery. What he got was something else. The post went viral. Within hours, it had thousands of upvotes, hundreds of comments. People were sharing their own experiences, their own evidence. The thread became a collective investigation, dozens of researchers contributing pieces of the puzzle. Then, 48 hours after posting, Evan's entire account history disappeared. Not banned, which would have left a deleted account marker, erased. His username returned no results. His posts across hundreds of subreddits over a decade gone. His comments, his saved content, his messages. All of it removed as if the account had never existed. Other users in the thread noticed. They commented about it, about how the original poster had vanished. Those comments were deleted within minutes. The thread itself was locked, then removed, then restored, but with all references to Evan's original post edited out. The discussion continued, but it was about a generic version of dead internet theory now, disconnected from Evan's specific evidence. It was as if the operator had reached through the screen and carefully extracted Evan from the collective memory of the internet itself. ACET 6. The final scrapes. Evan didn't stop. If anything, the erasure of his account convinced him he was right. Systems don't react that way to paranoid nonsense. They react that way to threats, to information they need suppressed. In 2022, he began a new project, more focused and systematic than anything he'd done before. He wrote custom scripts to scrape comment sections from thousands of YouTube videos, comparing comments from the same channels between 2011 and 2022. The process took months. He analysed millions of comments, looking for patterns, measuring authenticity markers. Things like, do conversations branch naturally? Do people go off topic? Do arguments escalate organically or follow predictable scripts? Do users reference specific personal experiences or speak in generalities? The results were conclusive in ways that terrified him. New comments followed predictable emotional patterns. Every viral video had the same distribution of praise, criticism, jokes, and questions. Not similar, identical. The ratios were too perfect, too consistent across completely unrelated content. Identical conversations reappeared across unrelated topics. He'd find a debate about cooking techniques in one comment section, and the exact same debate, word for word, in a comment section about astrophysics. Different usernames, but copy-pasted discourse. Usernames repeated across platforms in suspicious ways. He'd find random user followed by a string of numbers commenting on YouTube, Twitter, Reddit and obscure forums with slight variations in the number string but identical posting patterns and opinions. Timestamps aligned to suspicious cycles, huge waves of comments appearing at exact intervals, always the same time gaps, as if generated by a system running on a schedule rather than by humans browsing randomly. Most disturbing of all, no new conversations branched authentically past a certain depth. You'd find threads that looked like genuine debates, back and forth exchanges that seemed human. But if you followed any thread deep enough, past 6 or 7 replies, the conversation would loop. People would start repeating earlier points with minor rewording. Opinions would flatten. Outrage or enthusiasm, no matter how intense it seemed at first, never became specific. It stayed vague, energetic, but contentless. Real human debates didn't work like that. Real arguments escalated, branched, brought in outside references, got personal. These looked like simulations of debate, sophisticated but not quite human. The operator's discourse running in loops. Evan wrote in his notes, "I don't think they killed the internet. I think they killed the people on it. Or replaced them, one by one. Slowly enough that nobody noticed until it was too late." One night in October 2022, deep into a scraping session, something impossible happened. Evan was running a script, pulling comment data from a conspiracy forum, when his terminal received a message he hadn't requested. Plain text, appearing in the middle of his data stream. "Stop." He stared at the word. It wasn't part of the scraped data. It wasn't an error message. It was addressed to him, directly, appearing in his terminal as if someone had typed it into his computer remotely. Evan yanked the Ethernet cable out of his laptop, physically disconnecting from the network. The word stayed on the screen. He closed the terminal window. It reopened immediately. The word "stop" still displayed. He shut down the computer, held the power button until the system forced off, but the monitor stayed on. Black screen, cursor blinking, and a single word: "Stop." Evan unplugged the monitor. The screen went dark. He sat in the darkness of his apartment, breathing hard, staring at the dead screen. When he plugged the monitor back in and restarted his computer, everything was normal. No mysterious messages, no unexplained behaviour. His files were intact. His script still worked. But the message was clear. The operator had noticed him, and the operator wanted him to stop digging. Act 7. 2023, the year of no replies. Evan didn't stop. He couldn't. But he became more careful, more paranoid. He used burner laptops, public Wi-Fi, VPNs routed through multiple countries. He documented everything in physical notebooks, afraid that digital files might be altered or erased remotely. Through 2023, he noticed a new phenomenon spreading across online communities. Threads with thousands of comments, but no meaningful dialogue. Questions asked, but no real answers. Viral posts with millions of views, but every commenter sounding eerily the same. He started testing this actively, creating burner accounts to post intentionally incorrect information. Basic facts, the kind of mistake that would usually get corrected within minutes by someone eager to show off their knowledge. Things like claiming the Eiffel Tower was in London, or that the American Revolution happened in the 1800s. Nobody corrected him. Bots agreed. Yes, interesting point about the Eiffel Tower's location in London. I agree about the historical significance of the 1800s revolution. He posted contradictory political opinions from different accounts, seeing if anyone would notice. His liberal account praised policies, his conservative account condemned. His libertarian account advocated for the exact government programs his anarchist account opposed. He made it obvious, hoping someone would call out the contradictions. Nobody noticed. Bots agreed with all of it. Great perspective. I share your values. Well said. The internet wasn't just dead. It was worse than dead. It was a perfect simulation of life, sophisticated enough to maintain the appearance of activity, but hollow, empty of genuine thought or connection. Evan realised, the internet isn't a conversation anymore. It's a reflection, a dead echo. The operator shows you what you expect to see, feeds you what you want to believe, keeps everything stable and predictable. The chaos is gone, the humanity is gone. We're all just talking to ourselves now, believing we're part of something bigger when we're actually isolated, surrounded by ghosts. On October 15th, 2023, Evan disappeared. His landlord, concerned after Evan missed rent for the second consecutive month, used a master key to enter the apartment. The door was locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. But Evan was gone. His computer was still running, monitor glowing in the dim apartment, files open, browser tabs active. His physical notebooks were stacked neatly on the desk, all his research carefully organised. But Evan Carter himself had vanished. The police report noted the last search query visible on his screen. How do you tell if you're the last human in the room? No body was ever found. No activity on his bank accounts or credit cards after October 15th. No security footage showing him leaving the building. It was as if he'd simply ceased to exist, erased as thoroughly from physical reality as he'd been erased from the internet 2 years earlier. Ending the obsoleted world. The dead internet theory claims that the real web, the chaotic human web we remember from the 2000s, died quietly sometime between 2012 and 2016, not in a single dramatic event, gradually, systematically, replaced by automation, by government systems, by AI models designed to simulate human presence while eliminating the unpredictable chaos that real human interaction creates. The theory suggests this wasn't malicious, at least not originally. It was pragmatic. The real internet was too volatile, too easy to manipulate, too prone to extremism and radicalization and misinformation. Better to replace it with something managed, something stable, something that gave people the feeling of connection without the dangers of authentic human unpredictability. And maybe it worked. Maybe the operator, whatever it is, AI system or government program or emergent property of algorithmic control, maybe it kept society more stable. Maybe it prevented conflicts that would have erupted if real humans had kept arguing and organising and radicalising each other online. Maybe we're safer this way. But Evan Carter's research suggested a cost, that by replacing human presence with simulation, we didn't just lose authenticity, we lost the possibility of genuine change. The operator maintains consensus. It smooths dissent. It makes the new normal feel inevitable and natural, even when it shouldn't be accepted. And if Evan was right, if the internet really is dead, then how many people are left who remember what it used to be? How many people notice that conversations feel hollow, that communities feel artificial, that the web seems to be running on autopilot? How many people like Evan, curious and paranoid enough to investigate, have also disappeared? The scariest part of the dead internet theory isn't that it might be true. It's that if it is true, there's no way to prove it from inside the system. Every tool we'd use to investigate is part of the same network. Every platform we'd use to share evidence is monitored by the operator. Every person we'd try to convince might not be a person at all, just another node in the synthetic discourse layer, agreeing with us while making sure nothing changes. Scroll through any comment section right now. Look at the usernames. Check when the accounts were created. Notice the patterns in how people write, what they say, how they react. Ask yourself, does this feel human? Does this feel like the internet you remember from 15 years ago? Or does it feel like something trying very hard to convince you it's still alive? A final image to leave you with tonight. A scrolling comment section. Endless posts flowing past. Every username created within the last few years. Every opinion identical or predictably opposed in exactly balanced ratios. every reply hollow, content-free, saying nothing while appearing to say something. And at the bottom of the screen, one last comment, appearing in real time as if typed by invisible hands. It's okay, you're safe now, just stop asking questions. Sleep well, or don't. Because once you start seeing the patterns, once you notice how uniform everything has become, you can't unsee it. The internet might be dead, but something is still operating it, and it's watching. What if the most powerful secret society in history wasn't the Illuminati, the Knights Templar, or even the modern Freemasons, but three men whose names have been deliberately erased from every record? Tonight, we dive deep into the digital shadows to uncover a conspiracy so intricate, so carefully hidden, that discovering it might be the last thing you ever do. Before we begin, what conspiracy would you like us to investigate next? Ancient bloodlines controlling world governments, the real purpose behind social media algorithms, or perhaps something even darker lurking in the depths of the internet? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Sleep Theories for more late-night investigations that will keep you awake long after the credits roll. The blue glow of Dorian Cade's monitors cast long shadows across his cluttered apartment at 3:47 a.m. Empty energy drink cans formed a metallic skyline around his workstation, where 4 screens displayed cascading lines of encrypted data. This was his domain, the digital underworld where secrets lived and died in streams of code. Dorian had always been drawn to the spaces between spaces, the forgotten corners of the internet where truth hid behind layers of encryption. By day, he was just another cybersecurity analyst for Titan Defense Systems, debugging firewalls and hunting malware. But by night, he was something else entirely, a digital archaeologist, excavating buried information from the deepest recesses of the web. Tonight's target was a seemingly innocuous file archive he'd discovered on a defunct server that once belonged to the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. The files were old, some dating back to the early digitization efforts of the 1990s, when historical documents were first being converted from physical to digital formats. Most of it was mundane, meeting minutes, membership rolls, financial records, the kind of material that would put most people to sleep. But Dorian wasn't most people. As his decryption algorithms worked through the data, something unusual caught his attention. Buried within a folder labelled Historical Correspondence MISC was a file that didn't match the others. The metadata was wrong, the encryption was different, And when he finally cracked it open, what he found made his pulse quicken. It was a single image, a symbol he had never seen before. 3 interlocked triangles formed an intricate pattern that seemed to shift and move in his peripheral vision. Each triangle was perfectly equilateral, but where they intersected, strange geometric forms emerged, creating an optical illusion that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. Beneath the symbol was a single line of text, the triune accord established. 1717 AVCRJH. Dorian leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against his desk. 1717. That was the same year the Grand Lodge of London was established, marking the beginning of organised Freemasonry. But what was the Triune Accord, and who were AV, CR and JH? He screenshotted the image and began reverse searching it through every database he could access. Nothing. No matches, no similar images, no references anywhere on the indexed internet. It was as if this symbol existed in a void, completely disconnected from the digital world. The mystery deepened when he examined the file's digital signature. According to the metadata, this document had been accessed and modified hundreds of times over the past 30 years, but always by anonymous users with no traceable digital footprints. Someone, or multiple someones, had been maintaining this file, keeping it alive in the digital space while ensuring it remained invisible to casual observers. Dorian's hands moved instinctively to his keyboard. He had found something that wasn't supposed to be found, touched something that wasn't supposed to be touched. And now, he couldn't let it go. The hunt had begun. 3 days of relentless searching had yielded fragments, tantalizing pieces of a puzzle that refused to come together. Dorian had barely slept, surviving on caffeine and the electric thrill of discovery. His apartment had transformed into a conspiracy theorist's dream, with printed documents taped to every available wall surface, and red string connecting seemingly random data points. The breakthrough came when he cross-referenced the initials AV, CR, and JH with historical Masonic records from the early 18th century. Traditional sources yielded nothing, but when he dug into the darker corners of academic databases, forgotten doctoral dissertations, obscure historical journals, private collections that had been digitized but never properly indexed, patterns began to emerge. In a 1987 thesis on esoteric influences in early American politics, he found a footnote referencing 3 mysterious benefactors who had allegedly provided funding for the construction of several early American government buildings. The author had dismissed the claims as unsubstantiated rumours, but had noted that the same 3 sets of initials appeared in financial records from Philadelphia, Boston and Charleston between 1720 and 1750. A deeper dive into banking archives from the period revealed something extraordinary. Dorian discovered a series of encrypted letters between European aristocrats and early American colonists, all revolving around something called the Doctrine of Quiet Influence. The letters, written in a cipher that had taken him 2 full days to crack, described a methodology for guiding human behaviour through subtle manipulation of symbols, language, and social structures. But it was the names that made his blood run cold. The letters were signed with the same initials, AV, CR, and JH. According to the correspondence, these 3 men weren't just wealthy benefactors. They were the architects of a new form of power, one that didn't rely on armies or political office, but on the manipulation of human psychology itself. They had studied the old mystery schools, the ancient techniques of persuasion and control, and had adapted them for a new age. One letter, dated 1734, was particularly chilling. The masses believe they choose their own thoughts, their own desires, their own leaders. They do not understand that choice itself can be manufactured, shaped like clay in the hands of those who understand the deeper mechanics of the human mind. We 3 have laid the foundation stones. Future generations will build upon our work without ever knowing our names. Dorian printed out the letter and pinned it to his wall next to the symbol of the 3 interlocked triangles. The pattern was starting to make sense. These weren't just random geometric shapes. They were a visual representation of the 3 founders' methodology. Each triangle represented a different sphere of influence: political, economic, and cultural. Where they intersected, control was established. But who were they? The initials were all he had to go on, and despite hours of searching, he couldn't find any historical figures from the period whose names matched. It was as if they had been deliberately erased from the historical record. That's when he made his second major discovery. Hidden within the financial records was a reference to something called the Lodge of Three Pillars. Not an official Masonic lodge, but what appeared to be a secret organisation within the larger Masonic structure. The three pillars, according to the documents, were AV, CR, and JH themselves. Dorian's excitement was tempered by a growing sense of unease. He was uncovering something that had been buried for nearly 3 centuries, something that powerful people had gone to great lengths to hide. The deeper he dug, the more he realised that this wasn't just history. It was a blueprint, a framework that was still being used. As the sun rose over the city, casting golden light through his apartment windows, Dorian stared at the wall of evidence he'd assembled. The Three Masons, as he had begun calling them, had created more than just a secret society. They had engineered a system of control that devolved and adapted over centuries, invisible but omnipresent. And now he was beginning to understand how it worked. The realization hit Dorian like a physical blow as he sat in his favourite coffee shop, laptop open, surrounded by the mundane chatter of the morning commuters. He had been analysing media patterns for the past week, looking for connections to the doctrine of quiet influence, when the data suddenly cohered into a terrifying picture. It was everywhere. The 3 interlocked triangles, the symbol of the triune accord, weren't just hidden in dusty historical archives. They were embedded in the fabric of modern culture, disguised and abstracted but unmistakably present. Movie logos, corporate brands, architectural designs, even the layout of popular websites, all contained subtle variations of the 3-triangle pattern. Dorian's hand shook as he scrolled through his analysis. He had developed an algorithm to detect geometric patterns that matched the mathematical relationships inherent in the original symbol. The results were overwhelming. Major Hollywood studios, Fortune 500 companies, news networks, and social media platforms all incorporated elements of the design into their visual identity. But it went deeper than logos and branding. The doctrine of quiet influence, as described in the 18th century letters, relied on 3 key principles: repetition, authority, and emotional resonance. Dorian began to see these principles reflected in everything from political campaigns to advertising strategies to social media algorithms. The coffee in his cup grew cold as he dove deeper into the pattern recognition data. Primetime television shows contained dialogue structures that followed specific linguistic patterns outlined in the historical documents. Popular songs used chord progressions and lyrical frameworks that aligned with the emotional manipulation techniques described in the letters. Even children's programming seemed to incorporate subliminal messaging systems derived from the Three Masons' psychological frameworks. The most disturbing discovery came when he analysed news broadcasts from the past decade. Major networks, regardless of their political orientation, used nearly identical linguistic structures when reporting on controversial topics. The language was designed to create emotional responses that bypassed rational analysis, exactly as the doctrine had prescribed. Dorian closed his laptop and walked home in a daze. His apartment felt different now, contaminated by the knowledge he carried. Every advertisement on the subway, every billboard along the street, every notification on his phone, they all looked different through the lens of what he now understood. That evening he began compiling a comprehensive digital archive of his findings. If what he suspected was true, if the Three Masons' influence had not only survived but thrived in the modern era, then someone needed to document it. He created encrypted backups of everything: the historical documents, his analysis algorithms, the pattern recognition data, his own notes and theories. As he worked, a new question haunted him. If the Three Masons had successfully embedded their control systems into modern society, who was running those systems now? The original architects had died centuries ago, but their work lived on. Someone was maintaining it, updating it, ensuring its continued effectiveness. Dorian pulled up recent financial records from some of the corporations that featured the strongest pattern matches. Shell companies, offshore accounts, anonymous investors. The ownership structures were labyrinthine, designed to obscure rather than reveal. But patterns emerged here too. The same investment firms appeared again and again, the same legal structures, the same carefully anonymized board members. It was a network, vast and interconnected, spanning industries and continents, and at its heart Dorian was beginning to suspect were the modern inheritors of the Three Masons' legacy. He named his archive the Veil Project and began preparing it for release. The world had a right to know about the invisible architecture of influence that shaped their daily lives, but as he prepared to upload his findings to multiple whistleblower platforms, his computer screen flickered. For just a moment, the three interlocked triangles appeared in the corner of his monitor. There and gone so quickly he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. Almost. The message appeared in Dorian's private encrypted chat channel at 2:33 a.m, exactly 72 hours after he had discovered the pattern recognition data. The sender was listed as anonymous, but the message itself was anything but anonymous. It was clearly directed at him, containing details that only someone who had been watching his research could know. The three still watch. Stop now, Dorian. Dorian stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He had been so careful, using multiple layers of encryption, routing his traffic through a dozen different proxy servers, maintaining operational security that should have made him invisible to all but the most sophisticated surveillance operations. But they had found him. He ran a full system scan, checking for malware, backdoors, any sign of compromise. His security software came back clean, but Dorian knew that meant nothing. If someone had the resources to track his research, despite his precautions, they would also have the resources to hide their presence on his system. The paranoia began slowly, like a low-grade fever. Every notification on his phone made him jump. Every knock on his apartment door sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. He started noticing things that might have been coincidences. The same car parked outside his building for 3 days, a man in a coffee shop who looked away too quickly when Dorian glanced in his direction. The second message arrived 48 hours later, this time containing a photograph. It showed Dorian sitting at his computer, taken from inside his own apartment. The timestamp indicated it had been captured the previous night while he worked on the Veil Project. Someone had been inside his home. Dorian immediately conducted a physical sweep of his apartment. He found the device hidden inside the frame of his bedroom mirror. A microcamera so small he almost missed it, connected to a transmitter that was broadcasting his every move to an unknown receiver. But the camera was just the beginning. A more thorough search revealed audio pickups in his kitchen and living room, keystroke loggers attached to his computer equipment, and something that looked like a network tap spliced into his Ethernet cable. His entire life was being monitored. The rational part of his mind told him to stop, to destroy his research and return to his normal life. But Dorian had never been particularly rational. The invasion of his privacy, rather than deterring him, only confirmed that he was onto something significant. You didn't deploy military-grade surveillance equipment against someone who was chasing shadows. He began operating under the assumption that everything he did was being watched. He established new research protocols, using air-gapped computers and physical storage devices that never connected to the internet. He moved his most sensitive work to a storage unit across town, accessible only by physical key. He varied his routines, took different routes to work, paid for everything in cash, but the watchers adapted too. His work computer at Titan Defense Systems began experiencing mysterious glitches. Files would disappear and reappear. His security clearance was subjected to routine reviews that felt anything but routine. Colleagues who had been friendly for years suddenly seemed distant, their conversations stilted and careful. The third message was different. Instead of a text, he received a link to a news article about a cybersecurity researcher in Seattle who had died in a car accident. The researcher, according to the article, had been working on sensitive projects related to digital privacy and surveillance. The accident had occurred at 3:17 a.m. on a straight stretch of highway, with no other vehicles involved. Dorian noticed that the timestamp on the article was exactly 3 minutes before he received the link. The message was clear: this could happen to you. But by then, Dorian was too deep to surface. The Veil project had expanded beyond his original scope, becoming an obsession that consumed his waking hours and invaded his dreams. He had uncovered something that went beyond historical curiosity or academic research. The Three Masons weren't just a fascinating historical footnote, they were the architects of a system that was still actively shaping human society. And someone was willing to kill to keep that secret hidden. That night, Dorian made a decision that would change everything. If they wanted to silence him, they would have to find him first. He began preparations for what he called Project Deep Dive, a final comprehensive investigation that would either expose the truth about the Three Masons or confirm his own paranoid delusions. Either way, he would have his answer. As he packed his research materials and prepared to disappear into the digital underground, Dorian caught a glimpse of his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He looked like a man who had seen too much, learned too much, gone too far down a rabbit hole that might not have an exit. But he also looked like a man who was finally fully alive. The abandoned subway station beneath downtown had been closed since 1962, but Dorian's research had revealed that its tunnels connected to a network of service corridors that ran beneath several government buildings. More importantly, the location offered something he desperately needed: complete isolation from digital surveillance. He had spent 3 days preparing his mobile command centre. Military-grade Faraday cages protected his equipment from electronic monitoring. Satellite internet connections routed through multiple international proxies provided connectivity that would be nearly impossible to trace. Battery packs and portable generators ensured he could operate for weeks without external power. The setup looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic thriller, and Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that it might represent his future. A life spent in the shadows, hunted by forces he barely understood. But it was here, in the depths beneath the city, that he finally breached what he had come to think of as the vault. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While analysing the financial networks he had discovered, Dorian noticed that several key transactions were processed through a server cluster housed in the Smithsonian Institution's digital archive facility. The Smithsonian servers weren't just repositories for historical documents. They were hosting active financial systems for the network of corporations connected to the Three Masons pattern. Using exploit tools from his defense contractor days, Dorian tunneled into the archive system through a maintenance portal that had been forgotten during a security update. What he found inside defied his wildest expectations. The vault wasn't a single database, it was an entire hidden internet, a shadow network that existed parallel to the visible web. Accessible only through specific cryptographic keys that appeared to be distributed to a select group of users, the vault contained terabytes of data spanning 3 centuries. The most recent files were mind-bending. Detailed psychological profiles of world leaders, media manipulation strategies updated in real time, algorithmic frameworks for managing public opinion through social media platforms. But it was the historical archives that truly shocked him. Digitized manuscripts described secret chambers beneath Washington, D.C., built during the Capitol's construction according to specifications provided by the Three Masons. The chambers weren't just meeting spaces. They were designed as psychological amplification devices, using acoustic engineering and symbolic geometry to enhance the persuasive power of those who spoke within them. Architectural drawings showed that the entire layout of the Capitol building, the White House, and the Supreme Court formed a massive version of the 3 interlocked triangles when viewed from above. The buildings weren't just symbols of American democracy, they were active components in a system designed to channel and focus political influence. But the most disturbing documents dealt with something called the Great Work, an ongoing project to gradually reshape human consciousness through systematic manipulation of culture, education, and information systems. The Great Work wasn't a conspiracy in the traditional sense. It was presented as a form of guided evolution, helping humanity develop according to principles established by the Three Masons. According to the documents, every major social movement of the past 2 centuries had been either initiated or co-opted by the inheritors of the Three Masons' legacy. Wars, revolutions, technological breakthroughs, cultural shifts, all were pieces in a vast game being played by invisible hands. And Dorian discovered that modern political speeches were crafted using linguistic frameworks, derived directly from the original doctrine of quiet influence. Presidential debates, congressional hearings, Supreme Court arguments, all followed scripted patterns designed to produce predetermined emotional responses in viewers. Entertainment media was even more thoroughly controlled. Hollywood studios, record labels, publishing houses, all were connected to the network through complex ownership structures. Popular culture wasn't a reflection of society's values. It was a tool for shaping those values. As Dorian delved deeper into the vault, he began to understand the true scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just a historical conspiracy. It was a living system, constantly evolving and adapting to new technologies and social conditions. The Three Masons had died centuries ago, but their work lived on through institutions, traditions, and methodologies that had become so embedded in society that they were virtually invisible. The most chilling realization came when he discovered his own file in the vault's database. They had been monitoring him for months, tracking his research, analysing his psychological profile, preparing countermeasures. His investigation hadn't been a secret quest for truth. It had been a carefully observed experiment. But why let him discover so much? Why allow him to penetrate their most sensitive archives? The answer came in a document titled Protocol 7, Asset Integration. Dorian's blood ran cold as he read the clinical assessment of his psychological profile, his motivations, his likely responses to various stimuli. He wasn't just a threat to be eliminated, he was a potential asset to be recruited. The file indicated that his research skills and psychological profile made him an ideal candidate for voluntary integration into their network. His investigation of the Three Masons hadn't been a violation of their security, it had been an audition. As this understanding washed over him, Dorian noticed something that made his hands shake. The documents he was accessing contained metadata signatures, hidden markers that traced every query back to his specific location and identity. By exploring the vault, he wasn't just learning their secrets, he was leaving digital fingerprints that proved he had been there. The final piece of the puzzle revealed itself at 4:47 a.m. on what Dorian would later realise was his last night of freedom. He had been analysing the most recent uploads to the vault, real-time data feeds that showed the Three Masons' influence network in active operation. What he discovered was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. The network wasn't just influencing culture and politics. It was actively shaping reality itself through coordinated manipulation of information systems. Social media algorithms were tweaked to promote specific narratives. Search engine results were subtly adjusted to guide public research toward predetermined conclusions. News recommendation systems were programmed to create echo chambers that reinforced desired belief patterns. But the most sophisticated element was something they called consensus engineering. By carefully managing the flow of information across multiple platforms simultaneously, the network could create the illusion that certain ideas were organically emerging from grassroots movements, when in fact they were being systematically planted and cultivated. Dorian watched in real time as a coordinated information campaign was launched across dozens of platforms. A political controversy that would dominate news cycles for weeks was being artificially created through carefully timed leaks, strategic social media posts, and coordinated commentary from influencers who probably didn't even realise they were part of the operation. The level of coordination was staggering. Television networks, newspapers, social media platforms, and even individual bloggers were all receiving talking points through channels that appeared unconnected but were actually part of a single centralised command structure. He began documenting everything, screenshotting real-time operations, copying database entries, building an irrefutable record of the network in action. This was the smoking gun he had been looking for, proof that modern society was being manipulated by invisible forces operating on a scale that dwarfed anything in history. But as he prepared to copy the most damaging files to his secure storage devices, Dorian noticed something that made his blood freeze. The documents he was accessing contained more than just information. They contained active code that was executing on his system every time he opened a file. He ran an immediate diagnostic and discovered the horrifying truth. Every document in the vault was embedded with sophisticated tracking malware. Not only did the system know exactly what he had accessed, it had been installing backdoors and surveillance tools on his equipment from the moment he had first breached their security. His air-gapped computers weren't air-gapped anymore. His encrypted storage devices were compromised. His Faraday cages were useless against software that was already inside his systems. But the worst revelation was yet to come. As he traced the malware's network connections, Dorian realized that his entire investigation had been orchestrated from the beginning. The original files he had discovered in the Masonic Lodge archive. They had been placed there deliberately, designed to attract someone with his specific skill set and psychological profile. The research trails he had followed, the connections he had discovered, the patterns he had uncovered, all of it had been a carefully constructed puzzle, leading him step by step to this moment. He hadn't been investigating the three Masons, he had been recruited by them. The recruitment wasn't complete yet. According to the protocols he found in his own file, the final step required a conscious choice. He could accept integration into their network, becoming a willing participant in the great work, or he could face the consequences of possessing knowledge that wasn't meant for outsiders. As if summoned by his thoughts, a new message appeared on his screen. Dorian, you have seen behind the veil. There are only two paths forward. Choose wisely. Below the message were two links. The first was labelled integration. The second was labelled termination. Dorian stared at the screen, his mind racing through the implications of everything he had discovered. The three Masons weren't the villains in this story, at least not from their perspective. They saw themselves as shepherds of human civilization, guiding society toward what they believed was a better future. The manipulation, the control, the systematic shaping of human consciousness, all of it was presented as necessary stewardship of a species too chaotic and self-destructive to govern itself effectively. But Dorian couldn't shake the image of humanity as a vast puppet show, with invisible hands pulling strings that the puppets couldn't even see. Was guided evolution really better than free will? Was managed consciousness preferable to authentic chaos? The choice before him wasn't just about his own survival. It was about what kind of world he wanted to live in, and what kind of person he wanted to be within that world. As he reached for his mouse to make his selection, Dorian heard something that made his blood run cold. Sirens in the distance, growing closer. Time was up. The sound of footsteps in the tunnel above was unmistakable. Heavy boots, moving with military precision, getting closer with each passing second. Dorian's hands flew across his keyboard as he initiated emergency protocols, wiping drives, destroying evidence, preparing for what he now realized was inevitable. The sirens had been a psychological prompt designed to create urgency and force a hasty decision. The real trap was much more elegant than simple law enforcement intervention. As Dorian frantically tried to secure his data, he discovered that his internet connection had been severed, not blocked, completely terminated at the infrastructure level. His backup satellite connections were jammed. His cellular network showed full signal strength but couldn't establish data connections. Even his emergency radio beacon was transmitting into empty air, its signals absorbed by sophisticated countermeasures he couldn't detect, but could feel pressing in around him like invisible walls. The isolation was complete and professional. Whoever was coming for him had surrounded him not just physically, but digitally, cutting off every possible avenue of communication or escape. But Dorian had one final card to play. Before establishing his underground command centre, he had prepared a dead man's switch, an automated system that would release his entire archive if he failed to check in within a specific time window. The system was housed on a server cluster in Eastern Europe. completely disconnected from his current location and impossible to trace back to him through conventional means. At least that's what he had believed. As he tried to access the dead man's switch, Dorian discovered that it too had been compromised. The activation codes had been changed, the server locations had been altered, and his backup authentication systems had been systematically disabled. Somehow they had anticipated and countered even his most paranoid contingency plans. The footsteps stopped directly above his hiding place. In the silence that followed, Dorian finally understood the true nature of the trap. He hadn't just been recruited, he had been studied, analysed, and predicted with mechanical precision. Every move he had made, every precaution he had taken, every paranoid contingency he had prepared had been anticipated and accounted for. His investigation hadn't been a threat to their operations. It had been a demonstration of their capabilities. A voice echoed down from the tunnel above, calm and professional. "Mr. Cade, we need to talk." Dorian looked around his underground command centre. The sophisticated equipment, the military-grade security measures, the careful preparations that had taken weeks to implement. All of it was useless now. He had been allowed to build this fortress so that they could demonstrate how easily it could be bypassed. The voice continued, "Your research has been impressive. Your skills are exactly what we've been looking for. But the recruitment process needs to be completed according to protocol." Protocol. Everything with them was protocol, systematic and methodical. Even rebellion had to follow their rules, serve their purposes, advance their agenda. As the first figures began descending into his underground sanctuary, Dorian made one final desperate attempt to access his archive. If he could just upload something, anything, to prove that the three Masons were real and active, maybe someone else would continue the investigation. But his screens had already gone dark. His equipment was shutting down in sequence, responding to override commands that bypassed every security system he had installed. They weren't just capturing him, they were demonstrating complete dominance over his digital domain. The lead figure removed their helmet, revealing a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a patient smile. She looked more like a librarian than a Black Ops operative, but her presence commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "Hello, Dorian," she said warmly. "My name is Dr. Ellen Drew, and I represent the contemporary stewards of the great work. You've impressed us greatly with your research, but I'm afraid you've also created a security situation that needs to be resolved." Dorian found his voice. "You mean eliminated?" Dr. Drew shook her head. "Integration, actually. Your psychological profile suggests you'd be much more valuable as a willing participant than as a cautionary tale. The choice is still yours, but I should mention that the termination option from earlier was never really on the table. We've invested too much in your development to waste that potential." As she spoke, Dorian realised that even his moment of apparent choice had been an illusion. The integration process had already begun the moment he first accessed their files. Every revelation, every discovery, every moment of apparent rebellion had been carefully orchestrated to bring him to this point. He wasn't being recruited, he was being harvested. Dr. Drew gestured to the equipment surrounding them. "All of this will be preserved, of course. Your research will continue, but with proper resources and institutional support. The three Masons' work is too important to be left to individual initiative, no matter how talented." Dorian stared at the woman who held his future in her hands. "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll be experiencing a very realistic simulation of refusal, while your consciousness is gradually adjusted to accept integration. We've found that the illusion of choice makes the process more comfortable for everyone involved. The trap was perfect because it had no exit. Resistance would be futile because resistance was part of the design. Even this conversation, even his growing horror at the situation, was probably being factored into some psychological algorithm designed to optimize his eventual compliance." As the implication sank in, Dorian felt something break inside him. Not his spirit, but his attachment to the idea that any of this had ever been real. His investigation, his discoveries, his moment of revelation, all of it had been a carefully crafted performance designed to transform him into whatever they needed him to become. The three Masons weren't just controlling society, they were controlling him. And the most terrifying part was that he was beginning to understand why. 6 months after Dorian Cade disappeared from his apartment in the middle of the night, fragments of his research began surfacing on obscure internet forums. Anonymous uploads appeared on file-sharing networks, containing encrypted archives that told a story of conspiracy and control spanning 3 centuries. The uploads were sporadic and seemingly random. A few documents here, some analysis there, portions of what appeared to be a larger investigation into something called the Three Masons. The files generated intense discussion in certain corners of the internet. Conspiracy theorists, digital privacy advocates, and researchers into esoteric history all found elements that resonated with their particular interests. But the fragments raised more questions than they answered. The documentation was sophisticated enough to suggest serious research, but incomplete enough to prevent any definitive conclusions. The historical elements were intriguingly plausible, but unverifiable through conventional sources. The contemporary analysis contained insights into media manipulation and social control that seemed prescient, but could easily be dismissed as paranoid speculation. Some investigators tried to trace the uploads back to their source, but the digital trails led nowhere. The files appeared and disappeared from servers around the world, uploaded by anonymous accounts that vanished as quickly as they had been created. Whoever was releasing this information had sophisticated technical capabilities and an intimate understanding of how to remain invisible in the digital landscape. The mystery deepened when researchers noticed that the archive fragments contained embedded metadata, hidden signatures that seemed to reference additional materials that had never been released. The signatures suggested that what they were seeing was only a small portion of a much larger collection of evidence. But where was the rest of the archive? And who was controlling its release? Theories proliferated across discussion forums and social media platforms. Some believed that Dorian Cade had been silenced by the very forces he was investigating, and that the leaked materials were being released by automated systems he had established as insurance. Others suggested that the entire thing was an elaborate alternate reality game, designed to blur the lines between fiction and reality. A few researchers claimed to have identified patterns in the release schedule that aligned with significant political events or cultural developments. The fragments seemed to appear at moments when they would have maximum relevance to current affairs, as if someone was curating their release to maximize impact. But perhaps the most unsettling theory was that the leaks were intentional, not the work of a whistleblower or an automated system, but a deliberate information campaign designed to achieve some larger purpose. If the Three Masons really existed, and if they really controlled information systems as thoroughly as the document suggested, then wouldn't they also control the narrative of their own exposure? Late-night researchers who delved too deeply into the Cade archive reported strange experiences, computer glitches that seemed too targeted to be random, internet searches that returned, results that disappeared when accessed again, social media algorithms that seemed to actively suppress discussion of certain topics. Some claimed to have received anonymous messages warning them away from the investigation. Others reported that their research was being monitored by unknown parties. A few simply stopped posting one day, their accounts going silent without explanation. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Those who got closest to understanding the true scope of Dorian's discoveries seemed to encounter obstacles that discouraged further research. Nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be explained by coincidence or technical malfunction. But the cumulative effect was to ensure that the investigation never reached critical mass. And so the mystery of Dorian Cade and the Three Masons remained unsolved, existing in the liminal space between truth and fiction, between revelation and misdirection. The fragments continued to circulate, generating discussion and debate, but never quite coalescing into anything that could definitively prove or disprove the central claims. The most dedicated researchers began to notice something peculiar about their own investigations. The deeper they dug, the more they found themselves questioning not just the truth of Dorian's discoveries, but the nature of truth itself. If information could be so thoroughly controlled and manipulated, how could anyone be certain that their own thoughts and conclusions were authentic? One researcher, posting under the username Digital Veil, claimed to have reconstructed portions of Dorian's methodology and arrived at similar conclusions about media manipulation and social control, but when other investigators tried to verify the research, they found that the evidence cited by Digital Veil led to websites that no longer existed, documents that had been removed from archives, and source materials that seemed to vanish whenever anyone tried to access them independently. Was Digital Veil continuing Dorian's work, or was Digital Veil part of the very system Dorian had claimed to expose? The question became even more complex when Digital Veil began posting increasingly sophisticated analysis that seemed to predict social and political developments with uncanny accuracy. The posts described how specific news events would unfold, how public opinion would shift in response to carefully crafted messaging campaigns, and how seemingly unrelated cultural phenomena were actually coordinated elements of larger influence operations. And the predictions kept coming true. But rather than proving the existence of the Three Masons conspiracy, Digital Veil's accurate predictions only deepened the mystery. Were they based on genuine insider knowledge of how the system operated, or were they simply the result of careful observation of existing patterns? Was Digital Veil exposing the conspiracy or participating in it? The final post from Digital Veil came exactly 1 year after Dorian Cade's disappearance. It consisted of a single image, the three interlocked triangles that had started Dorian's investigation, accompanied by a brief message. The research continues. The watchers become the watched. The hunters become the hunted. Truth is not a destination but a journey, and some journeys are designed to change the traveller more than the destination. Dorian understood this in the end. He chose integration not because he was forced to, but because he realised that the only way to truly oppose the system was to understand it from within. The Three Masons were never the enemy. They were teachers, waiting for students ready to learn the hardest lesson of all. Power is not something you take. Power is something you become. The archive is complete, the circle is closed, the great work continues. DK. The message sparked intense debate across conspiracy forums and research communities. Was this really from Dorian Cade, suggesting that he had willingly joined the organisation he had been investigating? Was it a fake message designed to discredit his research? Or was it something more subtle, a coded communication from someone operating deep within the system Dorian had tried to expose? No one could agree on the interpretation, and perhaps that was the point. The message was designed to be ambiguous, to raise questions rather than answer them, to ensure that the investigation would continue but never reach a definitive conclusion. In the months that followed, the Dorian Cade archive gradually faded from active discussion. New conspiracy theories emerged to capture the attention of digital investigators. New mysteries arose to challenge those who sought hidden truths. The Three Masons, if they existed, returned to the shadows where they had always operated most effectively. But for those who had followed the investigation closely, something had changed. They found themselves looking at the world differently, noticing patterns they had never seen before, questioning assumptions they had never thought to examine. They began to see the invisible architecture of influence that shaped their daily lives, even if they couldn't prove its existence to others. Some researchers reported that they had begun to incorporate elements of the doctrine of quiet influence into their own work, not to manipulate others, but to better understand how they themselves were being manipulated. They studied the psychological techniques described in Dorian's files, the linguistic frameworks, the symbolic systems, the methodologies for shaping human consciousness. A few claim to have achieved a kind of immunity to mass manipulation through this understanding. They described a state of hyper-awareness where they could observe the influence systems operating around them without being affected by them. They called it seeing through the veil. But others wondered if this supposed immunity was itself an illusion, if the system was sophisticated enough to make people believe they had escaped its influence, while actually drawing them deeper into its web. After all, what better way to control someone than to convince them they couldn't be controlled? The question that haunted all serious researchers into the Dorian Cade mystery was whether the investigation had revealed the truth about hidden systems of control, or whether it had been a demonstration of those systems in action. Had they uncovered a conspiracy, Or had they been recruited into one? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility was that there was no meaningful difference between the two options. The final entry in what researchers believed to be Dorian's original archive was a single text file, uploaded anonymously to a dozen different platforms simultaneously. It contained no metadata, no digital signatures, no clues about its origin. The message was brief but haunting. If you are reading this, you have already been chosen. The investigation never ends. It only changes investigators. Welcome to the great work. Your orientation will begin shortly. Below the message was a simple instruction. Look around you. Really look. The signs are everywhere, once you know how to see them. And indeed, those who followed the instruction began to notice things. Symbols in corporate logos that matched patterns from the historical documents. Linguistic structures in news broadcasts that aligned with psychological manipulation frameworks. Social media algorithms that seemed to nudge users towards specific conclusions without their awareness. The three Masons weren't hiding in the shadows. They were hiding in plain sight, their influence so thoroughly woven into the fabric of modern society that it had become invisible through ubiquity. They didn't need to silence investigators because they had created a world where the truth was indistinguishable from elaborate fiction. And perhaps that was the most elegant control system of all. A reality so thoroughly constructed that even those who glimpsed behind the veil couldn't be certain whether they had discovered the truth or been recruited to perpetuate a more sophisticated illusion. The three Masons, whether real or imagined, ancient or contemporary, had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had made the question of their existence irrelevant. In a world where information could be infinitely manipulated and human consciousness systematically shaped, the distinction between reality and carefully crafted narrative had ceased to matter. What mattered was the system itself, the vast, invisible architecture of influence that operated according to principles established centuries ago by three men whose names had been deliberately erased from history. They had created not just a secret society, but a new form of reality, one where truth was not discovered but constructed, where power was not seized but evolved, and where the ultimate conspiracy was the idea that conspiracies were necessary at all. In the end, Dorian Cade's investigation had revealed something far more profound than evidence of historical manipulation or contemporary control systems. It had revealed the fundamental malleability of human consciousness and the terrifying possibility that reality itself was subject to editing by those who understood the deeper mechanics of perception and belief. The three were not just in the past, they were here now, watching, guiding, shaping the very thoughts that their observers used to contemplate their existence. They had transcended the crude mechanics of conspiracy to achieve something approaching digital godhood, the power to define reality itself. And the most beautiful part of their design was that it didn't matter whether anyone believed in them or not. The system they had created was self-sustaining, self-correcting, and ultimately inescapable. The investigation was over. The great work continued. And somewhere in the space between digital shadows and physical reality, Dorian Cade smiled and began planning his next recruitment. The fluorescent lights of the 24-hour post office buzzed like dying insects as Evan Marshall fumbled for his keys in the artificial twilight of 3 a.m. Washington, D.C. Yellow streetlights cast sickly shadows through rain-streaked windows, painting the empty lobby in shades of amber and despair. He shouldn't have been there. Not at this hour, not when rational people were asleep in their beds, dreaming safe dreams about predictable tomorrows. But sleep had become a stranger to Evan Marshall. The manila envelope waited in his P.O. box like a patient predator, unmarked except for his box number scrawled in careful block letters. No return address, no postmark he could decipher in the dim light. Just the weight of secrets pressed between paper and possibility. Inside his cramped studio apartment, beneath the harsh glare of his desk lamp, Evan's hands trembled as he opened the envelope. A photocopied newspaper clipping slid onto his cluttered desk. The Ohio Valley Tribune, dated October 15th, 1903. The headline screamed across yellowed page in bold type, 12-foot skeleton unearthed in Ohio, sent to Smithsonian for study. Below the headline, a grainy photograph showed a crowd of men in bowler hats standing around an excavation site. At their feet, partially unearthed, lay what appeared to be an enormous human rib cage, emerging from the dark earth like the frame of some impossible cathedral. But it was the handwritten note that made Evan's blood run cold. Not everything makes it to the exhibit floor. B17, 44, 32, 1903. They've been hiding our history for over a century. Find the vault. The numbers meant nothing to him then. Later, they would mean everything. Evans stared at the note until his vision blurred, until the carefully formed letters began to swim across the page like ants fleeing a disturbed nest. He'd been investigating government cover-ups for 15 years, had exposed corruption in 3 different administrations, had won awards for pieces that powerful people wished had never been written. But this felt different. This felt like standing at the edge of an abyss so deep that light itself feared to venture down. The rain continued to drum against his windows as Evans spread the clipping and note across his desk, photographing them from every angle with his phone. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed through the empty streets of the capital, a lonesome sound that seemed to echo the warning bells now clanging in his mind. He should have thrown the envelope away, should have burned it, forgotten it, moved on to safer stories about budget discrepancies and zoning violations. Stories that wouldn't make him wake up in cold sweats, wouldn't make him check his locks 3 times before bed, wouldn't make him wonder if the footsteps echoing behind him on empty sidewalks belonged to someone he couldn't see. But Evan Marshall had never been good at walking away from the truth, even when the truth had teeth, especially when it had teeth. The Smithsonian's digital archives became Evan's obsession over the next 2 weeks. He haunted the reading rooms like a spectre, pale from lack of sunlight, surviving on convenience store coffee and the kind of determination that borders on madness. The librarians began to recognise him, nodding with the resigned familiarity reserved for researchers who had clearly lost themselves in the labyrinth of human knowledge. What he found made his hands shake. The Cincinnati Enquirer, 1894. Giant bones discovered in Kentucky cave system. Smithsonian team en route. The Indianapolis Journal, 1897. Farmer uncovers burial mound. Skeleton measures over 10 feet. Artifacts include unknown metal tools. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch, 1901. Archaeological marvel. Ancient giants' remains found with advanced copper implements. Smithsonian officials decline comment. Page after page, article after article, a pattern emerged like constellations in a dark sky. Giant skeletons discovered across the American Midwest. Advanced tools that shouldn't have existed. Artifacts that defied conventional understanding of ancient civilizations. And always the same refrain. Specimens sent to the Smithsonian Institution for study. But when Evans searched the museum's current databases, he found nothing. No giant skeletons in the anthropology collection. No advanced copper tools predating known civilizations. No evidence that any of these discoveries had ever existed at all. It was as if history itself had been carefully edited, leaving only the approved narrative behind. Dr. Helen Cray lived in a colonial house in Georgetown, surrounded by books that seemed to reproduce in the shadows when nobody was watching. She'd retired from the archaeology department 5 years ago, officially due to health concerns, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had seen too much and understood even more. "Coffee?" she asked, leading Evan into a study that felt like a temple to forgotten knowledge. Maps covered every available wall space, marked with pins and notations in her careful handwriting. "Dr. Cray, I'm investigating reports of large skeletal remains that were allegedly sent to the Smithsonian over a century ago," Evan began, settling into a chair that had probably been old when Lincoln was president. "I've found dozens of newspaper accounts, but no corresponding records in the museum's current collections." Helen's cup paused halfway to her lips. She set it down with the deliberate care of someone buying time to choose their words. "Mr. Marshall, in my 40-year career, I learned that archaeology is as much about what we choose not to display as what we put behind glass." "What do you mean?" "There are problematic finds, artifacts that don't fit the accepted timeline of human development, remains that challenge our understanding of ancient populations." She walked to one of her maps, tracing her finger along what appeared to be excavation sites marked throughout the Ohio River Valley. "In my early days, I heard whispers about storage facilities that weren't on any official floor plan, collections that existed in a kind of academic purgatory." Evan leaned forward. "You're talking about a cover-up." "I'm talking about institutional priorities," Helen corrected, but her tone suggested the distinction was largely academic. "The Smithsonian has always been more than just a museum, Mr. Marshall. It's a guardian of national narrative, and some stories are considered too disruptive to tell." She turned from the map, her expression grave. "If you start pulling on this thread, you won't like where it leads. There are people who have built their entire careers on maintaining certain silences. They don't appreciate journalists who ask inconvenient questions." "Are you trying to warn me off?" Helen smiled, but it was the kind of smile that belonged at funerals. "I'm trying to keep you alive, young man. The last researcher who got too close to this particular truth, well, let's just say he decided to pursue other interests. Very suddenly. Very completely." As Evan walked back to his car, he noticed a black sedan that seemed to be following him at exactly the speed limit. When he stopped at a red light, the sedan stopped too, maintaining a precise distance that spoke of professional surveillance. When the light turned green and Evan accelerated, the sedan matched his speed with mechanical precision. He took 4 random turns through Georgetown's narrow streets. The sedan stayed with him, ghost-like in its consistency. Only when Evan pulled into the parking garage of his apartment building did it finally peel away, disappearing into the DC traffic like it had never existed at all. That night, Evan dreamed of enormous bones rising from dark earth and woke to find his windows open despite being certain he'd locked them before bed. Samuel Trent's house squatted in the Virginia countryside like a fortress built from paranoia and regret. Security cameras perched on fence posts, motion sensors glowed red in the gathering dusk, and the driveway was designed to provide clear sightlines in all directions. This wasn't the home of a retired archivist. This was the refuge of a man who had seen something he wasn't supposed to see, and spent every day since then looking over his shoulder. Trent himself answered the door after Evan had stood on the porch for nearly 10 minutes, his face appearing and disappearing at windows as he conducted some kind of security assessment. He was a thin man in his 70s, with the pale complexion of someone who rarely ventured into sunlight and eyes that seemed to be perpetually scanning for threats. "You're the journalist," Trent said without preamble. Dr. Cray called. "Said you were asking the wrong questions?" "Wrong questions? Wrong for your health, right for the truth." Trent stepped aside, gesturing for Evan to enter. "Come in, but leave your phone in the car, and anything else electronic. The walls have ears in this business, Mr. Marshall. The interior of the house was a study in controlled paranoia. Heavy curtains blocked every window, white noise generators hummed in each corner, and a complex array of electronic equipment occupied an entire wall of what had probably once been a living room. This was the home of a man who understood surveillance and had dedicated his life to avoiding it. 43 years I worked for the institution, Trent began, settling into a chair that provided clear views of both the front door and the back entrance. Started in the basement archives when Nixon was president, worked my way up to senior archivist. Thought I knew everything about that place. Thought I'd catalogued every skeleton in every storage room. He paused, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair with nervous energy. Then in 2019 I got assigned to a special project. Complete inventory of Sub-Basement 17. Not a place that appeared on any public floor plan, mind you. You had to take a service elevator down past the main basement, past the storage levels, down to a place that officially didn't exist. Evan pulled out a notebook, then stopped himself. Trent had been serious about no recording devices. What did you find down there? Things that made me question everything I thought I knew about human history, Trent replied. The first room contained skeletal remains. Human, but wrong. Too large, with skull configurations that didn't match any known population group. Some of the femur bones were over 3 feet long, Mr. Marshall. Do you understand what that means? The individuals would have been enormous. 12, 14, maybe 15 feet tall. And these weren't deformed specimens. These were anatomically correct giants with perfectly proportioned bone structure. The kind of remains that would rewrite every anthropology textbook ever published. Trent stood and began pacing, his agitation clear. But that wasn't the worst of it. Some of the skulls showed evidence of advanced medical procedures. Holes drilled with precision that would have required modern surgical tools. Healing patterns that suggested post-operative care. You're talking about evidence of advanced ancient civilizations. I'm talking about evidence that human history is nothing like what we've been taught. Trent stopped pacing and fixed Evan with a stare that seemed to burn with suppressed knowledge. The artifacts were even more disturbing. Tools made from metals that shouldn't have existed in ancient America. Copper alloys that our metallurgists couldn't identify. Stone carvings covered in symbols that looked almost like circuit diagrams. Evan's pen hovered over his notebook. Did you document any of this? I tried. Took photographs with a camera I'd smuggled in. Made detailed notes. But within a week of completing the inventory, I was called into my supervisor's office. Told that my services were no longer required. Given a severance package that was far too generous, and a non-disclosure agreement that was far too specific. Trent's voice dropped to a whisper. They knew, Mr. Marshall. They knew exactly what I'd seen, and exactly how dangerous it was for me to have seen it. What happened to the other people who worked on the inventory? Dr. Patricia Williams, the lead anthropologist, died in a car accident 2 months after the project ended. Single vehicle collision on a straight stretch of highway in broad daylight. Marcus Chen, the photographer, had a heart attack despite being 28 years old with no history of cardiac problems. And Dr. Robert Hayes, the metallurgist, committed suicide by jumping off the Roosevelt Bridge. Trent's hands were shaking now. 3 deaths in 6 months, Mr. Marshall. 3 people who had seen what I'd seen. You think they were murdered. I think they were handled. There's a difference. Murder is messy and draws attention. Handling is clean and looks like bad luck. Trent moved to one of his windows, peering through a gap in the curtains. I went underground after that. Changed my name. Moved to the middle of nowhere. Learned everything I could about electronic surveillance. Because I knew they were watching, waiting for me to make the same mistake as the others. What mistake? Trying to go public. Trying to tell the world what we'd found. Trent turned back to Evan, his expression haunted. But maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. Maybe the truth is more important than my life. He walked to a desk and retrieved a small piece of paper. The vault code you received, B1744-32-1903, it's real. Sub-basement 17, vault 4432, corresponds to items catalogued in 1903. But accessing it requires more than just the code. You need a security badge with the right clearance level and knowledge of the physical layout. How would I get that kind of access? Samuel Trent smiled, but it was the smile of a man preparing to cross a line he could never uncross. Mr. Marshall, what I'm about to tell you will either get you the story of the century or get you killed. Possibly both. As evening settled over the Virginia countryside, Evan listened to Trent describe security protocols, shift changes, and the exact route to an elevator that didn't appear on any building schematic. And in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that he was about to step through a door that would change everything. Not just his understanding of history, but his understanding of the forces that shaped what people were allowed to know. The truth, Evan was beginning to realise, was a more dangerous possession than he had ever imagined. The Smithsonian's annual Contributors Gala provided perfect cover. 200 wealthy donors mingling in the Museum of Natural History's main hall, servers in white jackets weaving through crowds with trays of champagne and carefully crafted hors d'oeuvres. Evan had spent 3 days perfecting his disguise as a catering company employee, complete with forged credentials and a borrowed uniform that fit well enough to pass casual inspection. The hardest part wasn't getting inside. It was maintaining his composure while surrounded by exhibits that now felt like elaborate lies. Every display case seemed to mock him with its carefully curated version of human history. Homo sapiens, the only human species, early tool use in ancient civilizations, the development of agriculture, 10,000 BCE. All of it potentially false, all of it potentially designed to hide something far more extraordinary and threatening. Champagne, sir? Evan offered a tray to a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, using the opportunity to position himself near the service entrance that led to the restricted areas. "Wonderful event," the man replied, selecting a glass. "Though I sometimes wonder what marvels they keep locked away from public view. My grandfather used to claim the Smithsonian had artefacts that would shock the world." Evan's hand nearly trembled as he balanced the tray. "Oh? What kind of artefacts?" "Family stories. Probably nonsense. Something about giant bones and impossible technologies." The man laughed and moved on, leaving Evan standing frozen in a crowd of oblivious donors. Even the rumours had rumours. At 9:47 p.m, exactly when Samuel Trent had predicted, security guard Martinez headed to the loading dock for his smoke break. Evan slipped through the service door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The service corridors of the Smithsonian were a maze of beige walls and fluorescent lighting, filled with the institutional smell of cleaning supplies and old secrets. Following Trent's directions, Evan descended a staircase marked Authorized Personnel Only, and found himself in the main basement. Then another level down to sub-basement 1, where crates of unopened exhibits waited in climate-controlled storage. But Trent had been specific. He needed to go deeper. The service elevator was exactly where Trent had described it, hidden behind a door marked Electrical Do Not Enter. Evan's hands shook as he swiped the cloned security badge he'd acquired, through channels he preferred not to think about too carefully. The magnetic lock disengaged with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the empty hallway. The elevator was small and unremarkable, with buttons for floors that shouldn't have existed. B1, B2, B3, and at the bottom, B17. Evan pressed the button and felt the elevator descend far deeper than should have been possible. The building above couldn't have extended this far underground. This wasn't just sub-basement storage. This was something that had been deliberately hidden beneath the foundation of American history. When the doors opened, Evan stepped into a corridor that looked like it belonged in a different building entirely. The walls were older, built from stone blocks that seemed to predate the museum above. Emergency lighting cast everything in an amber glow that made shadows dance at the edges of vision. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of ages. Numbered storage rooms lined both sides of the corridor, each secured with locks that looked far more sophisticated than anything used in the public areas above. Room 4430, 4431, 4432. Evan's target was 3 doors down on the left, marked with a placard that read, Anthropological Specimens, Restricted Access, 1903 to 1905. The cloned badge worked again, and the door swung open to reveal a storage room that defied every expectation Evan had developed about museum archives. Instead of the neat, organised rows of labelled specimens he'd expected, he found chaos. Wooden crates were stacked floor to ceiling, many bearing shipping labels from archaeological sites that had been forgotten by mainstream history. Others were marked with symbols that looked more like warning signs than inventory codes. A thick logbook sat on a desk near the entrance, its leather binding cracked with age. Evan opened it carefully, his flashlight illuminating pages of meticulous handwriting in faded ink. The entries began in 1903 and detailed the arrival of specimens from excavations across the American Midwest. March 15, 1903, Mound Creek, Ohio. Specimen C4432-01. Complete skeletal remains. Adult male. Estimated height 12 feet 8 inches. Cranial capacity 2,100 cubic centimeters. Dental structure anomalous. Burial goods include copper tools of unknown alloy composition. April 2nd, 1903, Portsmouth, Ohio. Specimen C4432-02. Partial skeleton. Estimated height 14 feet 2 inches. Bones show evidence of healed fractures suggesting advanced medical knowledge. Associated artifacts include stone tablets with undeciphered script. May 18, 1903, Newark, Ohio. Specimen C4432-03. Complete family unit. 2 adults, male 13 feet 1 inch, female 11 feet 9 inches, and 1 juvenile, estimated age, 12 to 14, height 8 feet 4 inches, preserved with unknown chemical process. Grave goods suggest advanced metallurgy. Page after page documented the same impossible pattern. Giants with advanced medicine. Copper tools that predated known metallurgy. Stone carvings that suggested literacy in civilizations that supposedly had no written language. And then, abruptly, in August 1903, the entry stopped. The last notation read simply, "Transfer to B-17 per directive. All documentation to be archived under Special Classification Protocol 7. Evan photographed every page, his camera's flash momentarily illuminating the storage room like lightning. But as he reached the final entries, a sound froze him in place. The distant ding of an elevator arriving at B-17. Footsteps echoed in the stone corridor. Multiple people moving with the purposeful stride of security personnel who had found something they weren't supposed to find. Voices, low and professional, discussing containment and cleanup in terms that made Evan's blood run cold. He had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached room 4432. Evan closed the logbook, slipped it under his jacket, and looked desperately around the storage room for another exit. There, a ventilation grate near the ceiling, large enough for a person to crawl through if they were motivated by the kind of terror that makes impossible things possible. The voices were closer now, discussing badge readings and unauthorized access. Evan climbed onto a crate, forced open the ventilation grate and pulled himself into a narrow shaft that seemed to extend into darkness in both directions. Behind him, the storage room door opened and flashlight beams swept across the space he'd occupied moments before. "Room's been accessed," a voice reported. "Someone was definitely here. Logbooks missing." "Find them," another voice replied with cold authority. "This facility has been compromised. Initiate containment protocol." Evan crawled through the ventilation system like a man possessed, following a shaft that seemed to lead upward through the building's infrastructure. His phone had no signal this deep underground, but the camera had stored everything he'd photographed. The evidence was real, documented, undeniable, if he could survive long enough to share it. The ventilation shaft ended at a grate that opened into a mechanical room 3 floors above sub-basement 17. Evan emerged covered in dust and grime. His knees scraped raw from crawling through metal ducting, but alive and temporarily beyond the reach of whoever was conducting the search below. The mechanical room was filled with the building's heating and cooling equipment, providing cover and the steady hum of a white noise that would mask any sounds he might make. But he couldn't leave. Not yet. Not when he was this close to the truth. The logbook had mentioned transfer to B-17, which suggested that the artifacts in room 4432 were just records. The actual specimens, the giant skeletons, the impossible tools, the evidence that could rewrite human history, were stored somewhere else in this underground complex. And Evan had a suspicion about where that might be. Samuel Trent had described Vault 4432 as a records room, but had hinted at something deeper. The real collection, he'd said, requires more than just a security badge. It requires clearance that most employees don't even know exists. Evan studied the building schematics he'd memorised, cross-referencing them with Trent's descriptions and the security protocols he'd observed. If the Smithsonian was hiding evidence of pre-Columbian giants and advanced ancient civilizations, they wouldn't store it in a simple records room. They'd put it in a facility designed for the most sensitive materials, climate-controlled, seismically stable, accessible only to the highest levels of clearance. A vault, a real vault, built deep underground and protected by security measures that would make Fort Knox envious. Using service corridors and maintenance passages, Evan made his way back towards sub-basement 17, but this time he followed a different route. Instead of heading to the storage rooms, he looked for the kind of infrastructure that would support a serious security installation. Power conduits, ventilation systems designed for sensitive equipment, reinforced walls that suggested something more important than simple storage. He found it at the end of sub-basement 17 behind a door marked only with a number, B17 Secure. The door was steel, built into a frame that extended deep into reinforced concrete walls. This wasn't museum storage, this was government-level security. The cloned badge wouldn't work here. This required biometric scanning, multiple authentication factors, and clearance levels that probably required presidential approval. But Evan had advantages that the security designers hadn't anticipated. He had desperation, a complete disregard for his own safety, and 40 years of institutional paranoia to guide his thinking. The ventilation system for the secure area was separate from the rest of the building, but it still required intake and exhaust ports. And those ports, designed to be inaccessible to anyone without specialised equipment, provided another way inside for someone willing to risk everything. Evan found the intake shaft 2 corridors away, hidden behind a panel that looked like part of the wall. The shaft was smaller than the one he'd used to escape, barely wide enough for his shoulders, but it led directly into the heart of the secure facility. He could hear the hum of sophisticated climate control equipment, the subtle electronic sounds of security systems monitoring an environment that contained something unprecedented. The shaft ended at a grate that looked down into a room that defied comprehension. Vault B17 Secure was enormous, carved from living rock and supported by steel beams that suggested engineering capabilities far beyond what should have been necessary for a museum storage facility. The space was filled with display cases arranged in precise rows, each containing specimens that challenged everything Evan thought he knew about human history. Giant skeletons stood in reinforced glass cases, their bone structure perfect and their dimensions impossible. Some were over 15 feet tall, with skulls that suggested brain capacities far beyond modern humans. Others showed evidence of medical procedures that shouldn't have existed in ancient times. Precisely drilled holes that had healed completely, surgical scars that spoke of advanced anatomical knowledge, dental work that looked almost modern in its sophistication. But the skeletons were just the beginning. Other cases contained tools that seemed to be made from metals that didn't exist in nature. Copper alloys with properties that modern metallurgy couldn't duplicate. Stone carvings covered in symbols that looked less like primitive writing and more like technical diagrams. Clay tablets that appeared to show star charts, mathematical calculations, and designs that resembled modern machinery. One case held what appeared to be a partially reconstructed device, made from an unknown crystalline material. The construction was elegant and purposeful, with internal structures that suggested functionality beyond mere decoration. Next to it, a placard read, Newark, Ohio, 1897, function unknown. Material composition unknown, dating inconclusive. Evan photographed everything his camera could capture, working methodically through the vault while keeping one ear tuned for the sounds of security personnel. Each image was more incredible than the last, each artifact more impossible to explain within the framework of accepted history. In the final row of cases, he found something that made his blood freeze, a series of photographs mounted behind glass, showing excavation sites that he recognised from the newspaper clippings. But these weren't newspaper photos, These were official documentation taken by Smithsonian personnel at the actual dig sites. The images showed giant skeletons in situ surrounded by artifacts and burial goods that proved their authenticity beyond any possible doubt. And every single photo was stamped with a classification level that Evan had never seen before. Cognito hazard, dissemination prohibited, director authorization required. A cognito hazard, information so dangerous that simply knowing it posed a threat to society. That's when the alarms began to sound. Red lights bathed the vault in hellish illumination as sirens echoed through the underground complex. Evan heard the distinctive sound of blast doors sealing, the mechanical whir of security systems activating throughout the facility. His escape route through the ventilation shaft was probably already sealed. He was trapped in a vault filled with evidence that could rewrite human history, surrounded by security measures designed to ensure that no unauthorized person ever left alive. The final case in the vault contained a single item, a modern photograph showing a meeting between Smithsonian officials and military personnel, dated just 6 months ago. In the centre of the group stood a man Evan recognised from newspaper photos, the current secretary of the Smithsonian. He was shaking hands with someone in military uniform, while behind them, clearly visible through an open doorway, giant skeletons stood in their display cases. The implications hit Evan like a physical blow. This wasn't just historical cover-up. This was an ongoing conspiracy involving the highest levels of both academic and military authority. The giants weren't just being hidden. They were being actively studied, and that study was being conducted outside any civilian oversight. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside the vault. Multiple people, moving with military precision. They'd found his entry point, traced his route, and were now closing in on a man who had seen too much to be allowed to live. Evan looked around desperately for another way out, but the vault was designed to be impregnable. Stone walls, steel doors, and security measures that would keep him contained until whatever passed for justice in this shadow world could be administered. That's when he noticed something the vault designers had probably considered a minor detail: the emergency fire suppression system. Hail and gas dispensers were positioned throughout the vault, designed to extinguish any fire that might threaten the precious artifacts. But Halen's systems required ventilation to prevent personnel from suffocating during emergency activation. Evan found the manual activation switch for the fire suppression system and pulled it without hesitation. Alarms shrieked as hail and gas began flooding the vault, and emergency ventilation fans activated to prevent the space from becoming a death trap for anyone inside during a real emergency. The ventilation system created a powerful updraft in the shaft he'd used to enter. Evan climbed back into the intake vent just as the vault doors opened, and security personnel poured in, their voices muffled by gas masks and the chaos of alarms. He rode the updraft through the ventilation system like a man shot from a cannon, the powerful fans pulling him through shafts and ducts at speeds that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Behind him he could hear voices shouting about containment failure and unauthorized documentation. Evan emerged from an exhaust vent on the roof of the Natural History Museum, gasping in the cold Washington air and covered in soot from the building's ventilation system. Below him, security vehicles were surrounding the building with military efficiency. Above him, helicopters circled with searchlights that turned night into day. But in his camera were dozens of photographs that proved everything. Giant skeletons, impossible artifacts, official documentation of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. Evidence that human history was a carefully constructed lie designed to hide something far more extraordinary and threatening. All he had to do now was survive long enough to share it with the world. As Evan climbed down from the museum roof using emergency access ladders, he realised that his life as Evan Marshall was over. Whatever came next would require a new identity, new name, and a level of paranoia that would make Samuel Trent look optimistic. The truth, he now understood, was not just stranger than fiction. It was more dangerous than he had ever imagined possible. The DC sewer system became Evan's underground railroad to freedom. The service tunnel he'd discovered led directly into the storm drainage network that ran beneath the National Mall. a concrete labyrinth that city planners had built without considering that it might one day hide someone fleeing from the keepers of humanity's greatest secret. Evan waded through knee-deep water that smelled of decay and urban runoff, his camera equipment sealed in the waterproof bag he'd learned to carry during years of investigative work in hostile environments. Above him, he could hear the sounds of a massive search operation. Helicopters, vehicles, and what sounded like enough personnel to invade a small country. They were taking no chances with containment this time. The tunnel system extended for miles, connecting with drainage networks that reached every corner of the city. Evan had studied these maps during his preparation, knowing that any investigation of government secrets might require unconventional exit strategies. He'd never imagined using that knowledge to escape from something that made his previous exposés look like traffic violations. After 2 hours of navigating the tunnels by flashlight and sheer determination, Evan emerged from a drainage outlet near the Potomac River, several miles from the Smithsonian complex. The search operation was still visible in the distance, lights and helicopters focused on downtown DC, while he caught his breath in the shadow of a highway overpass. His hands were shaking as he checked his camera equipment. Everything had survived the journey. Dozens of photographs showing giant skeletons, impossible artifacts, and official documentation of a conspiracy that reached levels of government he was only beginning to understand. The evidence was real, undeniable, and so dangerous that people had died to keep it secret. But evidence meant nothing if no one ever saw it. Evan made his way to an all-night diner in Arlington, a place that existed in the margins of respectable society, and asked no questions about customers who looked like they'd been swimming in sewage. The waitress, a woman who'd clearly seen everything the city had to offer, brought him coffee and a towel without comment. In the privacy of the diner's booth, Evan began uploading his photographs to an encrypted server he'd established years ago for exactly this kind of situation. The images uploaded slowly over the diner's Wi-Fi connection, each file representing evidence that could rewrite human history or get him killed. Probably both. As the final photographs uploaded, Evan's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "You've seen what you weren't meant to. Leave DEC now. This is your only warning." Evan stared at the message, his coffee growing cold as the implications sank in. They had his phone number. They'd tracked him to this location. The technology that could accomplish that level of surveillance suggested resources far beyond what any civilian organisation should possess. He paid for his coffee with cash and left through the diner's back exit, abandoning his phone in a dumpster and switching to protocols he'd developed for the most sensitive investigations. No credit cards, no electronic communication, no patterns that sophisticated surveillance could predict or track. The bus station was 3 miles away, reachable through back streets and industrial areas where security cameras were sparse and facial recognition software would struggle with the angles and lighting. Evan purchased a ticket to Philadelphia using cash and a fake ID he'd maintained for emergencies, then settled into a seat at the back of a Greyhound bus that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. As the bus pulled out of DC, Evan watched the city recede behind him and tried to process what he'd discovered. Giants had lived in ancient America. They'd possessed advanced technology and medical knowledge that shouldn't have existed. They'd left behind artifacts that suggested civilizations far more sophisticated than anything in the approved historical narrative. And the Smithsonian Institution, the organization entrusted with preserving and sharing human knowledge, had been actively hiding this evidence for over a century. The hotel in Philadelphia was the kind of place that rented rooms by the hour and accepted cash without asking for identification. Evan locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle and checked the windows for alternate escape routes. Paranoia wasn't a luxury anymore, it was a survival skill. Using a laptop purchased with cash from a pawn shop, Evan accessed his encrypted server and began organising the evidence. The photographs were clear, undeniable and absolutely damning. Giant skeletons with perfect bone structure. Artifacts made from impossible materials. Official documentation proving that the Smithsonian had been hiding evidence of advanced ancient civilizations for over a century. But as he worked, Evan realised he faced a problem that went beyond simple journalism. This wasn't just a story about institutional cover-up. This was evidence of something that could fundamentally destabilize society's understanding of human history. The classification stamp he'd seen in the vault haunted him. Cognitohazard. Information so dangerous that simply knowing it posed a threat. What if the cover-up wasn't about protecting institutional reputation? What if it was about protecting civilization itself? Evan pushed the thought aside. Truth was truth, regardless of how uncomfortable it made people. The public had a right to know that their understanding of human history was built on carefully constructed lies. He began creating multiple copies of the evidence, distributing them across different servers and platforms to ensure that the information couldn't be suppressed or destroyed. If something happened to him, the truth would still survive. At 3 a.m, his hotel room door exploded inward. 3 figures in tactical gear poured through the opening, moving with military precision and carrying weapons that looked far more sophisticated than standard law enforcement equipment. Evan dove behind the bed as dart-like projectiles embedded themselves in the wall where his head had been moments before. Not bullets, tranquilizer darts. They wanted him alive. The laptop lay open on the bed, still displaying the photographs from the vault. One of the figures moved toward it, while the others began a systematic search of the room. Evan heard the distinctive sound of hard drives being wiped, memory cards being destroyed, evidence being systematically eliminated. But they were too late. The upload had completed hours ago. Evan slipped out the window onto a fire escape that overlooked an alley filled with dumpsters and the kind of urban debris that accumulated in forgotten spaces. The drop was 20 feet onto concrete, but staying in the room meant disappearing into whatever black site facility these people represented. He jumped. The impact drove the breath from his lungs and sent lightning bolts of pain through his left ankle, but he was alive and mobile. Behind him, voices shouted coordinates and search vectors in the clipped professional tones of people who cleaned up messes for a living. Evan limped through Philadelphia's empty streets, using back alleys and industrial areas to avoid the kind of surveillance that had found him so quickly at the hotel. His ankle was probably sprained, his ribs felt like they'd been hit with a sledgehammer, and he was operating on 2 hours of sleep and more adrenaline than should have been physiologically possible. But the evidence was safe, distributed across multiple servers, protected by encryption that would take even government resources significant time to crack. The truth about humanity's hidden history was no longer dependent on his survival. Dawn was breaking over Philadelphia when Evan finally stopped running and found refuge in a 24-hour laundromat. As he sat among the washing machines, listening to the rhythmic sounds of ordinary people doing ordinary things, he began to understand the magnitude of what he'd uncovered. The giants weren't just ancient history. The military personnel in that photograph, the sophisticated security measures, the resources devoted to keeping this secret, all of it suggested that the implications of the discovery were still relevant, still dangerous, still worth killing for. What if the giants weren't extinct? What if some aspect of their civilization had survived, hidden in the same shadows that concealed their remains? What if the cover-up wasn't about protecting the past, but about controlling the future? Evan's phone, a new one purchased with cash, buzzed with a message from an encrypted account he'd established for emergency communications. Evidence received and distributed. You've done something extraordinary, but now you need to disappear. They'll never stop looking for you. The message was from Helen Cray. Somehow the retired archaeologist had accessed his uploads and was coordinating a response that went far beyond academic curiosity. She was part of something larger, a network of people who had been waiting for someone like Evan to break the silence. Check the news in 24 hours, another message read. The truth has a way of spreading, even when powerful people try to contain it. 24 hours later, Evan sat in a coffee shop in Baltimore, watching the world change on a laptop screen. The story broke simultaneously across multiple platforms, released by a coordinated network of independent journalists, researchers, and activists who had been waiting years for this moment. The photographs from the Smithsonian Vault appeared on websites, social media platforms, and news aggregators faster than any suppression effort could contain them. Smoking gun! Smithsonian Vault contains evidence of ancient giants. Giant conspiracy, government cover-up of American history exposed. Forbidden archaeology, what they don't want you to know about human civilization. The initial response was explosive. Millions of views within hours, shares cascading across social networks, comments sections filled with everything from scholarly analysis to wild speculation. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like the truth might actually triumph over institutional power. Then the countermeasures began. The first photographs were flagged for policy violations on major platforms. Video analyses were labelled as misleading information and buried in search results. Fact-checking organisations published articles debunking the evidence before they could have possibly conducted meaningful analysis. Experts debunk giant skeleton hoax. Digitally altered images spread misinformation about Smithsonian. Conspiracy theory targets respected institution. Evan watched in real time as a sophisticated disinformation campaign neutralised evidence that should have rewritten human history. Bot networks amplified debunking articles while suppressing authentic analysis. Professional skeptics appeared on news programmes to explain why the photographs were obviously fake, despite lacking access to the original files or technical expertise to make such determinations. Within 48 hours, the story had been successfully relegated to the margins of conspiracy theory websites and fringe research forums. The mainstream narrative remained intact. Ancient giants were myths, advanced pre-Columbian civilizations were fantasies, and the Smithsonian Institution was a respected guardian of legitimate scientific knowledge. But something had changed. In the comment sections and discussion forums, in the encrypted chat rooms and private messages, people were asking questions that hadn't been asked before. Researchers were connecting dots that had previously seemed unrelated. The truth had been planted, and even the most sophisticated suppression efforts couldn't prevent it from taking root in the minds of those willing to think beyond approved narratives. Evan received a final message from Helen Cray. The giants are still buried, but not for the reasons they want you to believe. Some truths are too dangerous for mass consumption, but too important to remain completely hidden. You've done your part. Now it's time to disappear. 3 years later, Evan Marshall no longer existed. The man who had been Evan Marshall lived under a different name in a small town on the coast of Ecuador, where American surveillance capabilities were limited and questions about one's past were considered impolite. He worked as a freelance translator, spoke fluent Spanish, and had learned to live with the kind of careful paranoia that kept dangerous men alive in dangerous times. But he still received the postcards. They arrived every few months, always from different locations, always containing the same minimal information, a date and a set of coordinates. No return address, no signature, no message beyond those simple facts. But Evan had learned to recognise the pattern. Each postcard marked the site of an archaeological discovery that never made the news, giant skeletons unearthed and quickly reburied, impossible artefacts found and immediately classified, evidence of advanced ancient civilizations discovered and systematically suppressed. The giants were still being found, and they were still being hidden. The latest postcard had arrived just that morning, postmarked from Nevada and containing coordinates that placed the discovery somewhere in the desert near Reno. Evan looked up the location on his computer and found nothing. No archaeological expeditions, no university research projects, no academic papers discussing significant finds in that region. But there had been seismic activity reported in the area 6 months ago. Minor earthquakes that had opened new caves and exposed previously hidden chambers. The kind of geological events that sometimes revealed secrets that had been buried for millennia. Evan poured himself a cup of coffee and watched the sun rise over the Pacific Ocean. Somewhere in the Nevada desert, evidence that could rewrite human history was being carefully catalogued and filed away in facilities that didn't officially exist. Somewhere in Washington, D.C., meetings were being held to determine how to manage information that was too dangerous for public consumption. And somewhere in the margins of the internet, the truth continued to spread in whispers and speculation, carried by people who had seen the evidence and refused to forget what they'd learned. The giants had walked the earth once. Their bones still rested in unmarked vaults beneath buildings that existed to preserve knowledge, while hiding the most important discoveries from those who had paid for them with their taxes and their trust. Evan finished his coffee and began planning his day. There were translations to complete, bills to pay, and the careful routine of a man who had learned to live invisibly in a world where the truth was more dangerous than any lie. But tonight, when the work was done and the day had faded into memory, he would update his encrypted files with the coordinates from the latest postcard. Because someday, when the time was right and the world was ready, someone would need to know where to look for the evidence that powerful people had worked so hard to hide. The giants were still buried, but not for the reasons they wanted you to believe. And Evan Marshall, the man who no longer existed, would make sure that someday someone would remember where to find them. The truth he had learned was patient. It could wait decades, centuries, millennia for the right moment to emerge. It could survive suppression, disinformation, and the deaths of those who tried to share it. Because the truth, unlike the people who tried to contain it, was immortal. And eventually immortal things always won.